The second half of the 18th century was rough in French society, weakened from countless wars with England, a recent defeat in the Seven Years' War, and shy to repayment from the Americans after helping them stick to the English once again. To top it off, a literal volcano exploded in Iceland, setting in a cloud of sulfur and ash, which led to abnormal weather patterns across Europe, killing livestock and crops, creating food shortages in the late 1780s. An effective government would have struggled with this start, but the regime of King Louis XVI in France was not up for the challenge whatsoever. At this time, the French society was broken into three different groups or states that dictated both your social class and role. The Catholic clergy was the first because God's number one. The king and the aristocracy were the second, meant to govern and take care of the military. And literally everybody else was the third estate, and they also did just about everything else. The third estate did include professionals and business owners, so some of them were wealthy, but they accounted for about 98% of the population, but about 80% of them were incredibly poor. A big reason for this was that the third estate was also on the hook for paying the actual taxes of the nation, as the first and second estate paid little to no taxes, but they would always reap the benefits of a wealthy nation. The third estate was also expected to pay like 5 to 10% of their total income to their church as like a tithe for some reason, but these issues would snowball as they continued to be passed on from one regime to the next. After all, it was their God given right to be at the top of society, and it was the peasants' God given duty to pay for it.
Past, it's God's law, oratoris, the priests who pray for us, laboratoris, the plebs who shovel shit and pay taxes, and bellatoris, the warriors who protect the ones on their knees or in the fields.
But soon enough, the ideas of the Enlightenment started taking root in Paris, allowing for a push for change in the situation. Ideas such as natural rights to man, liberty, immense equality before the law, property, security, and the right to resist oppression were beginning to basically take household thought in the late 1780s, thanks to political pamphlets and cafes that housed constant discussion of these thoughts and other Enlightenment thinkers. As the nation's woes grew, people found themselves yearning for these ideals enough to fight for them. As they saw the flaws in the system, the government of Louis XVI was losing its legitimacy, and a need for change continued to grow in the people. The crown would find itself in need of more cash, as by the late 1780s, half of the nation's revenue was solely going into propping up their debts. This was, unsustainable to say the least. So, the king realized that they would need to collect more taxes, but the third estate had already been squeezed, and he knew his friends in the first and second estate would not want to pitch in for real. So, indecisive as always, Louis said, fuck it, we'll do it live, and called on the Estates General to see if they could figure it out instead. But now, the States General was the closest thing to a modern government that France had at this time. It was basically supposed to be representatives from all the three states coming together to do government stuff. But the problem was, like, at this point, they hadn't been called upon since like 1614. So about 175 years to this time, which is now May 15th, 1789. So to say that nobody truly knew how this part of the government worked was an understatement. Nobody knew how like authority over the sessions worked, and like most importantly, the voting system was like incredibly flawed. As we said, about 98% of the population was the third estate, which totaled to about 27 million people. They got a collective one vote. The clergy had about 300,000 people in it. They also had one vote, and the nobles, with a population of around 200,000, also had one vote. This disparity was not lost on the members of the third estate and those sympathetic to them as well. So there was kind of like a deadlock, and a reworking of the voting system was tried, but it did not work out. So the third estate kind of realized they were the overwhelming majority of the country, and also ultimately it was going to be them who would foot the bill for the decisions made here. So they decided they could make their own government. These ideas and the actions that would come were spearheaded at the Estates General by men such as Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Champagne and representative of the Third Estate, who viewed morality and virtue as above all, and a heavy critic of the death penalty, and also by a delegate from the clergy who empathized with the Third Estate named Emmanuel Joseph Sias, who had also written a pamphlet titled "What is the Third Estate?"
Hi, I'm Saul Goodman. Did you know that you have rights? The Constitution says you do, and so do I.
A very influential document, with one of its most important tenets being the idea that France was the people and the people were France, not this long held ideal that the nation was a king and his subjects because of divine right and so forth. So on June 17th, 1789, they created the First National Assembly. separate from the monarchy. So obviously, the king wasn't thrilled. So when everybody tried to come back for their next session on the 20th, the king had locked the door and tried to kind of like sort of make it seem like they were just taking a break for the day. But the whole thing just gave off very suppression vibes. So the representatives took it as such and moved the assembly not far down the road to a tennis court. This would become the place where the representatives of the Third Estate and their supporters made a promise to each other that they would keep meeting until they had a national constitution. So King Louis turned a dispute about taxes into people realizing that they are the nation and that he was the emperor with no clothes, and them kind of making a blood pact to create a new form of government. Big brain. King Louis's indecisiveness and lack of foresight would continue to be on display as directly after the tennis court oath, instead of cracking down on the government's whole thing that we don't need a king, he kind of just said, like, y'all don't have power, but he also begged them to come back at the same time. But the assembly said, like, no, we pinky promised each other that we're going to keep meeting and we're not going to break that for you. So instead of doing anything to stop them, because once again, he is the king, for some reason, he said, screw it, we'll play ball, and told the other two estates to join the National Assembly. So he hesitated so hard on ending the other government that he made it legitimate by having his government join theirs. Genius. As June turned into July, the king would call about 30,000 troops to move on Paris. This very much looking like an invasion force ready to squash the revolution was not lost on the people. On July 11th, the king would dismiss Jacques Necker, the very popular and reform minded finance minister, another signal to the people that repression was coming. Over the next few days, mass demonstrations would turn to clashes with troops. Paris would also form a citizens militia, which would later turn into a national guard, but they kind of had an army, but no guns. So they were ransacking a military hospital looking for guns, but didn't find any gunpowder. So on July 14th, 1789, the crowds would attack the prison fortress in the center of Paris, known as the Bastille. A symbol of the regime's oppression in the heart of their city, this violent and symbolic event would end in them getting pike decorations in the shape of Bastille Governor Delaunay and Paris chief official Jacques de Flessel to parade in the streets. Word would get to King Louis about these events the next morning, and he would ask, "Is this a revolt?" To which his assistant must have let out the biggest internal sigh ever and said, "No, sire, it is a revolution." In under a month, the situation had gone from chan shit with the boys without the king's permission to using the heads of government officials to send a message. As the summer of 1789 passed, fear would continue to grow both in the revolutionaries and the elites. The people of Paris were influenced by rumors that the nobles were planning to starve them, so they attacked their manors and destroyed feudal records, which in turn scared the elites into the abolition of feudal privileges to try to appease them. Feudalism in France, or the practice of your landlord basically owning you as a part of his land, was now dead, signaling the first true change in the structure of French society. The next big step would come as the revolutionary principles would be codified. Known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, this proposal would guarantee all citizens, well, like mostly men, but still progress. It would guarantee equality before the law, popular sovereignty, and the natural rights we spoke about, hoping to end the privileged state in France and be a solid stepping stone towards a written constitution. Once again, the king would hesitate, and as food shortages continued, the people grew restless. They noticed that the king and the assembly as a whole were in Versailles, about a 4 hour horse ride away, were not truly privy to the adversities the citizens faced every day. This lack of transparency, at a time when the king was delaying his decision on key legislation, gave way for the people to take action. So on October 5th, large crowds of Parisians, mostly women, made the days long march to Versailles to demand bread and the approval of the reforms. During their journey, the crowd would grow large, and once there, violence broke out between the crowds and the royal guards. This would end in the royal family being relocated to the Tuileries Palace by the crowd to show them real life in Paris. While they would still rule for the time being, they would essentially be under house arrest here. This 2 day event, known as the October Days, was an early sign of a weakened monarchy and its disposition to bend the knee. The National Assembly would follow as well, having the revolution completely centralized in Paris at this stage. Shortly after, in November of 1789, the Assembly would seize all church property in hopes to fix the nation's finances, not only ending the church's separation from the state, but making it its own financial tool. This was followed by the abolishment of noble titles and most barriers based on social norms. So the French social playground was not kind of even, and it created this strange time where the old inhibitions and expectations of the society really had no bearing on the people. They did things, interacted with others, and went places that a few months ago they wouldn't have been able to. But in some sense, French society at this point was still a free for all because a lot had been abolished, but not much had been established. Now firmly in 1790, the old French provincial system was replaced by a department system, which is actually basically how the French Republic works today, with some minor tweaks, but let's not spoil the whole show. This aimed to centralize the authority of the French government and solidify it as an administrative state because while the revolution was super cool and rad in Paris, outside a lot of the people simply either couldn't care to be involved with the revolution or were slightly against it due to its treatment of the church or sympathies for the royals. While not a direct counteraction to this growing anti revolutionary sentiment, at the same time, political activity and clubs in particular would explode, the Jacobins being one of the most prominent, fastest growing, and radicals of the bunch. This was led by Robespierre and another fellow French lawyer, Georges Danton. This boom was the beginning of the idea that politics is a continuous activity rather than something confined to episodic events. Completing the church's integration on July 12th, 1790, from now on, all bishops would be elected officials who aimed to uphold the revolution. This drew anger both from those loyal to the church and Rome itself. The crown was hollow in its power, the church was alienated and under state control, and this whole social reset even included a whole new calendar system, and it wouldn't go noticed to those outside of France, especially those related to the royals. Queen Marie Antoinette would begin writing her brother, Leopold II of Austria. They created an escape plan for the family to the town of Malmedy on the Austrian border. From here, the royals would hope to be able to mount a sort of counter-revolution from the outside. So in June 1791, the royals would attempt their escape, leaving behind all of the evidence of their distaste for the revolution. Incredibly quick side note about Marie Antoinette. She almost definitely did not say the whole like let them eat cake thing, but this was a pretty good representation of her disconnect with the life of the French people. She spent most of her time playing dress up or even cosplaying as a farmer because she had a farm installed in the palace's backyard. The Parisians began calling her Madame Deficit, so deserved or not, she became one of the most hated symbols of the revolution. The royal family would get so close but be stopped at Varennes on June 20th after being alerted by the previous postmaster to suspicious people. You see, the king kind of stood out because he was posing as a royal servant who would have been decently fit since he was like, used to working, but the king was the 18th century equivalent of this. So once they compared his face with the bill, the jig was up, and the National Guard would escort them back to Paris. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, hit the bell type thing. Next week, a week from today, I'm going to be coming out with the second part to this. We're going to be watching how the royal family comes back to the revolution, what it's like, the violence as it takes like a really deep root in the revolution as a whole, and then how they do a few 360s as they change one autocratic leader for another like a few times. So yeah, like I said, if that's something you're interested in and you enjoy the video, I really appreciate if you'd be back next week to watch it. Thank you.